Dune Part 2 is Denis Villeneuve's much anticipated sequel to the first installment all the way back in 2021. It's almost impossible to talk about Part 2 without first talking about Part 1. It's also very difficult to give my full thoughts on both films without spoiling them, so spoiler warning. But before I do all that, I want to talk about the previous Dune films. Dune was a 1984 film that David Lynch tried to make but was forced to adhere to studio demands, resulting in a bizarre mess that he ultimately disowned. The entire film rushes through each plot point like they're trying to squeeze as much as possible into a single film, which isn't a good idea when you're trying to adapt a novel as dense as Frank Herbert's Dune. It's hilariously clunky in its execution, with 2 exposition dumps back to back at the start. Some characters have internal monologues, which I guess is accurate to the book, but it doesn't serve the film in any meaningful way. Whenever a character achieves something, there's no weight to it because nothing is properly developed. It's corny and dated, it's difficult to take any of it seriously. It serves lethal tonal whiplash when contrasted with the Villeneuve films. Not a single good performance to be found. I don't hate this movie, and there are some aspects that I actually like. The score and sound design and the practical effects were all well done. As thrown together as it is, I can't call it a bad movie. Sure, it's not a good movie either, but there are other movies that are so much more lazy and cynical. So when I see a gross, squishy practical effects monster, I can't help but be won over by it. I'd recommend this because it's morbidly fascinating. This film is more interesting to talk about than it is to watch. You could spend hours performing an autopsy on it. I don't hate this, and it has some charm to it. As messy and as dated as it is, I can't bring myself to give this thing anything lower than a 5 out of 10. Next up is Jodorowsky's Dune, which is a 2013 or 2014 documentary, depending on who you ask. It was directed by Frank Pavich and tells the story of Alejandro Jodorowsky's failed attempt at making a Dune adaptation back in the mid-70s. Jodorowsky was too ambitious, resulting in a project that collapsed under the sheer size of its own weight. Alejandro Jodorowsky is a Chilean-French filmmaker who is known for making surreal, avant-garde films that focus on mysticism, religion, and philosophy. The only film so far that I've seen from him is The Holy Mountain, which is a movie that would make any sober person feel like they were on drugs. Jodorowsky himself is an endlessly charismatic figure. You could listen to him talk about anything. Jodorowsky's personality permeates throughout the entire documentary, as the story of him assembling the cast and crew is as interesting as the failed film itself. The documentary features concept art and storyboards, making it fascinating to think about what could have been. Jodorowsky is such a one-of-a-kind artist that we'll likely never see his interpretation of Dune on screen. This is a must-watch for fans of Dune, fans of Alejandro Jodorowsky, and even fans of H.R. Giger. I'm feeling a 7 out of 10 on this. So, there have been many failed attempts at adapting Frank Herbert's Dune throughout the years. Jodorowsky couldn't even get his project off the ground, and Lynch's iteration was an unfortunate disaster. The story is too big to fit onto the screen. Eventually, it was Denis Villeneuve's turn to helm an adaptation. Villeneuve is easily one of the best filmmakers working today. His output during the 2010s might be the most impressive streak of any director, living or dead. It ended on Blade Runner 2049, which was easily the best sci-fi film of the decade. What he achieved on 2049 made him a prime candidate for a Dune adaptation. If anyone could do it, it was him. And he did, but at a cost. Dune Part 1 unfortunately doesn't stand on its own as a film, but it is a necessary step for the story. It helps set up characters and conflicts that couldn't possibly be crammed into one film, but ultimately feels like half of a story rather than the first part of a story. It has horrendous pacing issues, which range from scenes that drag on, all the way up to one of my least favourite endings to a film. The ending to this sucks. When I first saw this, I thought there was another hour of runtime left, and then it just cut to black. The ending is so abruptly anticlimactic that they might as well have ended it mid-sentence. Having seen this film 3 times now, I think I can definitively call it an unsatisfying experience. While I appreciate it more in hindsight for being necessary for Part 2, I still think they could have made this film a more worthwhile experience. Maybe add something more consequential so that it doesn't just feel like a 2-hour, 35-minute prologue. There's an action scene at the very start of Part 2, so maybe Part 1 could have ended on that instead of the fist fight with subpar choreography. What dampens the experience even more is how boring every character is. Not a single one has any discernible or interesting personality. Timothée Chalamet feels miscast in the lead and gives some subpar line deliveries. Despite the fact that this is a Villeneuve film, some technical aspects feel sloppy. The score is comedically overblown with obnoxious melodramatic peaks that lose their impact with how overused they are. Some of the CGI looks bad, which is insane because Blade Runner 2049 has some of the best visual effects of all time. In part 1, some of the textures and proportions don't look fully realised, which puts a bad taste in my mouth. Alright, enough whining. This is absolutely one of the most gigantic spectacle films of recent years. It's overwhelming from a production standpoint. The cinematography, sound design, costume design, and production design are all fantastic. There are parts where it certainly feels like the most expensive film ever made. The CGI isn't all bad, as some of it looks utterly pristine and lifelike. I still don't think there should be any blemishes for a movie of this scale, but I can't condemn the entire product. The sandworms look as though they occupy the same space as the human characters, giving them a much more immediate presence. They help accentuate the film's already massive scale. Unfortunately, I don't really like this movie. I think Villeneuve could have done much better with it. I've already given it 3 chances, and each time I felt unsatisfied with the overall product. I find this film to be a boring slog. It has too many flaws to truly live up to the spectacle that it's trying to be. I wish that this was more of a complete experience. I'm feeling a 5 out of 10 on this. Yes, I'm giving it the same score as the David Lynch film. Cry about it. So, did you get any of that? Yeah? Okay, now I can talk about Dune Part 2. Dune Part 2 is a vast improvement over Part 1. Feels like an even grander cinematic spectacle than the first film. This thing is mind-blowingly gargantuan, delivering set pieces that make Avengers Endgame seem like a grain of sand by comparison. Every single issue that I had with the original has been fixed here, except for one, which I will get to later. The characters are much more defined here. Instead of being brick walls, they now have actual emotions and relatability. Timothée Chalamet redeems himself and delivers a legitimately fantastic performance. This might be his best performance yet, honestly. In Part 1, Rebecca Ferguson's character was one of the most forgettable parts of an already forgettable movie. In Part 2, her character becomes one of the most compelling aspects the story has to offer. Very refreshing to see Austin Butler give an actual performance for once. He is effectively intimidating and is one of the film's many highlights. Since they have better definition, I was able to connect with the characters much more. There are instances of genuine emotion in this. When Paul discards Chani in favour of Princess Corino, I was able to feel the betrayal Chani felt. I can't emphasise this enough. There was absolutely nothing like that in Part 1. Save for maybe 2 or 3 moments, I was never bored. The film manages to convey a level of urgency that is equal to its massive scale. The action scenes are exciting, either because of slick choreography or because of their excessive magnitude. The sci-fi technology on display is fascinating, offering an imaginative glimpse into the world. Lots of liquids being extracted through tubes. The CGI looks stellar. There's still a fleeting moment where it doesn't look rendered properly, but the vast majority of it is outstanding. The score is more appropriately used when compared to Part 1. The cinematography has much more personality than the first film, with more invigoratingly dynamic shots. The use of colour has a strong aesthetic appeal. I really love the orange haze of the eclipse action scene and the monochrome look of the Colosseum. Now, as I was watching this film, I was thinking, wow, this is awesome. I can't wait to see where this is going. I am very excited to see how this all resolves. The movie then ends on a cliffhanger. We get more blue ball bullshit. I went from loving a film to being pissed off at it in the span of 15 seconds. I thought the deal was that we got one movie a setup and one movie a payoff. I thought this was going to be the last one. I thought this was the end. I thought we were going to be finished with Dune after this movie. Apparently now it's a trilogy. I feel like I got scammed. Fool me once. Aside from getting yet another abrupt cliffhanger ending, I really liked this movie. It's a technical marvel that features some career best performances. It's everything you'd want from a gigantic sci-fi epic. Not happy that we have to wait for Part 3, I would have much rather that this just be the final Dune film that we got. If Part 3 is as good as this, then maybe it'll be worth having to endure 2 unsatisfying endings. For now, I'm feeling a 7 out of 10 on this, but it could very likely go up in the future. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you.